What if the stranger fixing your laptop was actually the person who knew your deepest secrets 20 years ago? This powerful CEO thought her childhood pen pal was a memory until a technical glitch connected her past to the present. You won't believe the moment she recognizes his handwriting on her screen. On the 23rd floor of Oraline Technologies, there was controlled anarchy. Executives on glass halls with tablets, legal papers, coffee cups long ago gone cold. Outside the cavernous conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, staffers spoke urgently on headsets as financial analysts revised projections by the minute. Inside, investors from 3 separate countries waited for the presentation that would decide the company's future. And at the center of it all, Victoria Hale, the 38-year-old CEO known for her precision and emotional control, the woman nicknamed the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley. She wore a charcoal suit that fit like a glove, her stance acute enough to scare a room full of boardrooms, and her voice steady as she ran through the final details of a multi-billion-dollar transaction. To everyone around her, Victoria was untouchable. But beneath the sleek confidence, agony was tightening in her chest. There was more to the combination than merely money or market share. If the sale fell apart, years of sacrifice and hard work could be gone in an instant. She reached for her laptop to start the final presentation, but as soon as her fingers hit the keys, the screen flashed uncontrollably. A peculiar clicking sound came from the inside of the machine. Then the screen turned absolutely black. The room went silent. One of the executives laughed nervously. It's just a phase. But Victoria could tell immediately that something was awry. Her in-house IT director was already rushing forward, trying every reboot sequence possible, sweat forming along his forehead. Nothing was working. Another sharp clicking from the hard disk, then silence. "Please tell me this is a joke," Victoria whispered softly, but the menacing calm in her voice made everyone around her take a step back. The IT director gulped. "Maybe the drive is bad." Those 4 words hit the room like an explosion. That laptop held the final merger papers, private investor details, undisclosed financial information, and years of encrypted business strategy. But none of that scared Victoria as much as the other data buried deep within the system. Behind layers of encryption was a personal archive she'd kept for decades. Handwritten letters she had scanned from her youth. Letters written by the one person who had made her feel safe throughout the darkest years of her life. Nobody knew they were there. Nobody was meant to find out. She had taken them through every promotion, every city, every reinvention of herself, because they were the only evidence left that the scared little girl she'd previously been had ever mattered to anyone. "Call whoever you need to call," said Victoria coldly. "I expect to have the data back before noon." The in-house staff sprang into rapid action, making emergency contacts to specialized recovery firms around the city. 50 minutes later, the office doors opened again, and a man came uncertainly into the executive level, carrying a worn rucksack and a rusty metal tools. Ethan Cole felt terribly out of place among the slick marble floors and the costly and cut clothing. His dark jacket exhibited signs of wear, his boots bore traces of moisture from outside, and tiredness etched his face in a way that suggested sleep had become a luxury rather than a need. He apologized quietly for being late, saying his daughter's school bus had broken down that morning, causing him to find emergency childcare before hurrying downtown. Nobody believed the explanation. The executives just looked at him doubtfully, plainly not believing this jaded freelance engineer could save what their elite in-house staff could not. Victoria crossed her arms as Ethan carefully set the lifeless laptop on the meeting table. "You understand what this gadget means?" she demanded fiercely. Ethan nodded and looked at the gadget. "I know it's important to you," he said in a low voice. Her answer surprised her a little. In her view, most people simply cared about the money involved. Ethan seemed to be after something simpler and oddly more human. But she wouldn't give in. "You have 2 hours before this company loses a billion-dollar merger." Ethan looked at the ruined drive, ignoring her threats. He'd handled considerably worse pressure than enraged executives for years. 3 years before he had lost his wife to cancer and learned how to handle hard conditions with silent fortitude. He did freelance IT work during the day, fixed servers at night, and yet managed to be there for his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Some months he could hardly pay the rent. Other months he would go without food, so Lily wouldn't know how close they were to falling apart financially. Corporate fear didn't frighten him anymore, not compared to hospital expenses and eviction notifications. Victoria led him into her private office with a skyline view. The room was a manifestation of all that people thought of her. Smooth furniture, neat order, and emotional remoteness. But Ethan did see one little thing that didn't fit the picture. Behind a framed company award, half hidden, was an old snapshot of a small girl standing by a rural mailbox and shyly staring at the photographer. Before he could get a better look, Victoria walked over to the windows and spoke sternly. "Get the files back. Don't open anything you don't need to." Ethan nodded and his fingers flew across the keys of the laptop. He plugged up recovery tools and external devices, and lines of garbled code flickered across the monitor. It would be a nice procedure. One error can ruin everything that is left on the damaged disk forever. Outside, rain ran down the windows, and the office was tense for hours. Victoria hadn't even sat down, pretending to look over merger documentation while really observing everything Ethan did. She was helpless, utterly helpless, for the first time in years. Her empire, her secrets, and the fragile relics of her history were now the property of a tired, single father she'd met less than an hour earlier. Rain beat on the tall windows of Oraline Technologies, the city below dissolving into streaks of gray cars and blurred lights. The mood in Victoria Hale's private office was strained, painfully so. The merger meeting had already been postponed twice. Executives paced nervously outside the glass walls, and financial experts were sending urgent texts to Victoria's phone every few minutes. But she didn't care about any of it. Her eyes were glued on the broken laptop Ethan Cole had left open in front of her. The grizzled freelance tech worked with great concentration, his fingers deftly navigating recovery software as external drives hummed faintly beside him. It was a gradual, tentative process. Corrupted pieces of files flashed on the screen only to be gone seconds later. Every successful recovery felt precarious, fleeting, as if one were trying to salvage a memory from a burning home before the roof fell in. Ethan leant back a little, wiping his eyes while another data sector reassembled itself line by line. "The drive's worse than I thought," he said softly. "Some files may not be recoverable." Victoria's mouth went rigid immediately. "The business files must be preserved," she added firmly, even though she knew it wasn't the whole truth. Ethan saw the slight quiver in her voice despite her tight demeanor. He'd spent years learning to read them. Being a single dad had shown him the hidden tiredness, the hidden anxiety, the loneliness that people covered behind professionalism. Victoria carried power like armor, but there was something about this laptop that scared her in a very intimate sense. He started another recovery routine, skipping each of the corrupted sectors of the system. Suddenly, a secret encrypted directory was showing on the monitor. The title was simple, penpal. The words surfaced, and Victoria breathed sharply. Ethan sensed her whole body tighten behind him. "Stop!" she said quickly, coming up to the desk. "Not that folder." Ethan nodded nicely and tried to go beyond it, but before he could divert the process, the damaged recovery system automatically generated thumbnail previews. The screen was strewn with several scanned handwritten letters like shards of another lifetime. Notebook paper faded, blue ink. Doodles at the corners like a child. Ethan's breath seized in his throat. Recognition hit him like a sledgehammer, and his hands fell away from the keyboard. One letter included a tiny dragon sketch curled around the page margins, something he used to draw all the time as a kid. Another had crooked handwriting with a signature he hadn't seen in over 25 years. "Your guardian knight." He'd left the office. For a moment, he was not a struggling IT contractor in an opulent skyscraper. 12 years old again, alone beneath the flickering bulbs of a foster home. Writing letters to a girl he'd never met, but nevertheless understood better than anybody on Earth. Victoria noticed the shift in his face at once. Her voice tightened with panic. "Shut it," she whispered. But Ethan scarcely heard her. Memories came back with agonizing clarity. He remembered the children's outreach program that matched lonely kids around the country as anonymous pen buddies. He remembered how he had waited impatiently for letters addressed to Knight, for they were sometimes the only bright spots in his terrible life. And most clearly, he remembered the girl who signed her letters with the name of Sparrow. She wrote about hiding in her bedroom as people shouted downstairs, pretending to be invisible at family events stuffed with rich strangers, about looking out her bedroom window and wishing someone in the world could see her. Ethan had replied to each letter with care, attempting to sound brave even while his own life seemed damaged beyond repair. Victoria looked away from the monitor, shaken. For years, those letters had been the dearest of her secrets. Long before she was a feared CEO, she was a frightened youngster locked within a mansion that never seemed like home. Her father ruled by fury and intimidation. Her mother had long since departed emotionally before she finally took off. The only safety young Victoria ever knew was in the handwritten communications with a boy who called himself Guardian Knight. He never judged her for being scared, never laughed at her being lonely. Somehow he got her to believe she was worth surviving with nothing but paper and ink. Those letters were her emotional lifeline. She'd saved every single one of them, digitizing them years later, because losing them would be like losing the final proof that she had mattered enough to someone once to matter whether she lived or died. Ethan looked at the calligraphy, his heart thumping like a drum in his chest. Could it be her? The dominant woman who ran billion-dollar enterprises and dominated boardrooms? The lonely girl who wrote shakily about being afraid of being frigid and unlovable? He had 1,000 questions to ask, but professionalism kept him mute. He was still an employee in the office of his customer. That felt like a scary line to cross. Victoria turned back to him cautiously, but the ICE CEO mask was starting to break. Her eyes glistened a little as she glanced at the flashing files on the screen. Then Ethan knew, behind the beautiful suits and the ruthless reputation, the fragile girl still alive, the girl who had knelt by a mailbox yearning for another letter from someone who understood her anguish. And by some miracle of faulty technology and unlikely chance, fate had reunited them after decades apart. For many long seconds, neither of them said. Outside the office, executives kept fretting about financial deals and shareholder expectations. But none of it mattered anymore in that peaceful chamber. Because two lost kids had just found each other, hidden inside a dying hard drive. The storm outside intensified as thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline, rattling the towering glass windows of Oraline Technologies. Inside Victoria Hale's office, silence stretched heavily between her and Ethan Cole. The glowing monitor illuminated both of their faces while the recovered penpal folder remained open on the screen like a doorway into another lifetime. Neither of them seemed able to look away from it. Ethan's heart pounded as he carefully continued the recovery process, though his thoughts were no longer focused entirely on corrupted sectors and damaged files. Every scanned letter that surfaced pulled him deeper into memories he had spent decades trying to bury beneath work, responsibility, and survival. Across the room, Victoria stood motionless beside the windows, her carefully constructed composure visibly weakening with every passing minute. Another recovered file suddenly opened automatically on the monitor. The scanned page appeared faded and wrinkled with age, but the handwriting remained unmistakable. Ethan recognized it immediately because he remembered exactly when he had written it. He had been 13 years old, sitting on the floor of a crowded foster home while rain leaked through the ceiling into metal buckets nearby. Earlier that night, he had received one of Sparrow's letters describing how terrified she felt, listening to her father scream at her mother downstairs. Ethan had stayed awake long after the other children fell asleep, trying desperately to think of something comforting to say. Now those words stared back at him from the screen after 25 years. "I'll protect you from the world until you're strong enough to protect yourself." Victoria's breath caught sharply in her throat. Her entire body stiffened as tears instantly filled her eyes. For years she had carried those words silently inside her heart, like a shield against every cruel thing life threw at her. She remembered reading that letter over and over beneath her blankets, while hiding from another violent argument downstairs. A lonely boy somewhere in the world had promised she would survive, and somehow she had believed him. Ethan stared at the sentence in stunned silence, realizing he had unknowingly carried someone through unimaginable pain with nothing more than childhood kindness. Victoria slowly stepped closer to the desk. Her voice trembled for the first time since Ethan met her. "Nobody else knows those words," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard but remained silent. Then Victoria looked directly at him, emotion breaking through the final cracks in her guarded expression. "Knight?" she asked softly. The childhood nickname hit Ethan like a physical blow. For a moment, he could only stare at her. Then, almost instinctively, he answered with the name he had not spoken aloud in decades. "Sparrow!" Victoria covered her mouth immediately as tears spilled down her cheeks. The cold, untouchable CEO vanished completely, replaced by the frightened little girl who once poured her heart into handwritten letters because she had no one else in the world to trust. Ethan felt his own eyes burn unexpectedly. Neither of them cared anymore about professionalism, corporate hierarchy, or the billion-dollar merger waiting downstairs. Time itself seemed to collapse around them until only the memory of two lonely children remained. "It was really you," Victoria whispered shakily. "All these years I wondered what happened to you." Ethan leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the impossible coincidence of fate bringing them together again through a broken laptop. "The program stopped forwarding letters suddenly," he explained quietly. "I wrote 3 more after your last one, but they all came back unopened." Victoria lowered her gaze. "My father found the letters eventually," she admitted. "He thought they were a distraction." After that, everything changed. Pain flickered across her face as old memories resurfaced. Ethan understood without needing details. Some wounds spoke loudly enough through silence alone. They sat together beside the glowing monitor while the storm raged outside. Slowly, carefully, they began sharing pieces of the lives they had lived after losing contact. Ethan told her about aging out of foster care at 18 with no family, no savings, and nowhere to go. He described years of struggling through low-paying jobs before eventually discovering he had a talent for repairing technology. Then came marriage, a brief period of happiness, and devastating loss when his wife died from cancer 3 years earlier, leaving him alone to raise their daughter, Lily. Victoria listened quietly, her heart tightening painfully with every word. The boy who once promised to protect her had spent most of his adult life barely surviving himself. Meanwhile, Ethan struggled to process the woman Victoria had become. The frightened girl who once confessed she was terrified of being weak now commanded boardrooms full of powerful executives without blinking. She had built one of the most successful tech corporations in the country through sheer intelligence and relentless determination. Yet despite her wealth and influence, Ethan could still see traces of Sparrow beneath the polished surface. The loneliness in her eyes, the exhaustion hidden behind perfection, the desperate need to appear invulnerable. Victoria finally laughed softly through her tears. "You know the strangest part," she said. "I kept your letters all these years because they reminded me that strength didn't mean becoming cruel." Ethan looked at her in surprise. She smiled faintly. "Whenever the corporate world tried to turn me cold, I reread them. You always sounded brave even when I knew you were hurting too." Ethan shook his head with quiet disbelief. "I was just a scared kid trying to help another scared kid." "Exactly," Victoria replied gently. "And somehow that mattered more than anything else in my life." The monitor chimed softly as another batch of files completed recovery, but neither of them moved immediately. Sitting there together beneath the dim office lights, they both realized something extraordinary had happened. Against impossible odds, the connection that once saved 2 broken children had survived decades of separation, pain, and entirely different lives. And now, after years of believing those letters belonged only to the past, they had finally found each other again. A delicate gold reflection shimmered across the glass towers surrounding Oraline Technologies as the morning sunlight gently cut through the storm clouds above Chicago. The turmoil that had gripped the executive offices the night before was finally over. The broken laptop sitting on Victoria Hale's desk had been fully recovered, the merger files restored successfully, the encrypted penpal archive safely backed up on numerous hard devices. Wearied execs downed drinks downstairs to the fact the billion-dollar deal was still on. The phones rang ceaselessly, the assistants scurried from meeting to meeting, investors complimented Victoria's leadership for guiding the company through the tragedy. But none of those wins felt quite so vital to Victoria now. For the first time in years, she was not thinking only about business strategy and competitiveness and control. Her eyes were on the still guy sitting across the desk from her. Ethan Cole, the boy who had unwittingly helped save her life long before they both knew just how much those letters from childhood had meant. The office mood was radically different from the night before. The frigid tension that had pervaded the room was replaced with something warm and vulnerable and very human. Empty coffee cups lay scattered on the recovery equipment, old scanned letters still open on the monitor. Victoria studied Ethan attentively now that the shock of recognition had worn off. She saw the weariness he attempted to cover when he thought no one was looking. She saw how frequently he looked at his watch, evidently anxious about the work awaiting him beyond the office door. Most of all, she saw in him the serene patience, the same calm constancy that had once calmed a terrified little girl writing letters from an unhappy mansion. Time had aged him, hardship had worn him down, but the heart of kindness in him was still intact. Finally, Ethan turned off the recovery program and sighed. "Everything's recorded," he remarked quietly. Your files are safe? Victoria nodded, but they did not rise immediately. For the moment, professionally, their meeting was done, but both of them saw that something much more important was just starting. Ethan looked at the window, then suddenly at his phone again. Fear shimmered in his eyes. I'm late, he said. Victoria sat up a little straighter. Your little girl? Ethan nodded apologetically, putting up his equipment. Her before-school program charges extra after 8. I forget how long it was. As he said, discomfort crept into his countenance. He loathed talking about his personal problems, obviously, especially to someone as strong as Victoria. Victoria didn't waste any time picking up her workplace phone. I'll have my driver take you, she said. Ethan looked up right away. You don't have to do that. Then it is if you don't want to get another late fee, she said coolly. Ethan opened his mouth to complain again, but Victoria astonished him even more. And Ethan? Let me help you. The words were hard to speak. For most of her adult life, she had believed that dependence made individuals weak. She had always feared to accept vulnerability. But standing next to the boy who had vowed to protect her from the world somehow made honesty less scary. Ethan looked her over for a moment, then shook his head with a slight smile. You always did hate owing people favors. Victoria blinked in surprise. Then he said softly, You wrote that in one of your letters. The remembrance made her chuckle softly, for the first time in years, a real laugh, unadulterated with corporate performance or forced charm. You recall that? I remember them all, Ethan said. The confession lay warm between them. In the weeks that followed, their lives began to intertwine in ways neither expected. Victoria had Ethan take a long-term consulting position with Oraline Technologies, but she presented it as a professional opportunity and not charity. Finally, Ethan accepted, knowing the stability would allow him to spend more time with his daughter rather than working various jobs every day. Slowly, the crushing fatigue that had become his life began to give way. Those were the days when even Victoria was changing. Employees noticed small variations fairly immediately. The fearsome CEO, who formerly intimidated entire boardrooms, now listened more during meetings. She stopped seeing every interaction as a struggle to be won. Sometimes she even smiled, which assistants gossiped about like a business miracle. But the real shifts were happening behind the scenes. One Saturday afternoon, Victoria arrived at Ethan's modest apartment for supper, after Lily demanded to meet the lady from Daddy's computer rescue. The Wii U. Little flat couldn't have been more different from Victoria's magnificent penthouse. Half the living room was littered with toys while cartoons played gently in the background. The mismatched furniture filled the little space, but somehow it felt warmer than anywhere Victoria had lived for years. Lily loved her on sight. Her school paintings held up proudly, Ethan cooking noodles in the kitchen. Watching them together, Victoria felt something strange and unpleasant stirring within her, not jealously but longing. She had collected all her riches and all her achievements, and yet she knew she had wasted years in the company of adoration without ever really connecting to anybody. Later that night, after Lily had drifted off to sleep on the sofa, Victoria and Ethan sat in silence by the apartment window, watching the city lights twinkle below. Just think how strange this is, Victoria asked softly. Ethan nodded slightly. That two kids who wrote letters found each other again after 25 years somehow? She nodded. No, he responded after a moment. I think some people are meant to find each other eventually. Victoria stared at him, her chest constricting with emotion. Her world was for years characterized by technological algorithms, wealth, digital empires, endless displays. But in the end, it was something brutally basic that made all the difference. Two lonely kids choosing to be kind, one handwritten letter at a time. Those remarks endured decades of distance, heartache, and reinvention. Sitting with Ethan as the city glittered outside, Victoria recognized something she'd forgotten long ago. Strength does not mean being untouchable. Sometimes true strength was to let yourself be found again.